Imagine installing Arch Linux for its bleeding-edge packages, Debian for its legendary stability, Ubuntu for its massive software ecosystem, and Gentoo for its extreme customization, and instead of choosing just one, your system somehow runs all of them together as if they were a single operating system. At first that sounds impossible, almost like a fantasy Linux users might joke about on forums. Traditionally, the Linux world has always forced users to make a choice. You pick a distribution and live within its ecosystem. If you choose Ubuntu, you get apt and Ubuntu repositories. If you choose Arch, you get Pacman and the Arch repositories. If you go with Fedora, you use DNF and the Fedora ecosystem. Each distro has its own package manager, its own philosophy, its own release cycle, and its own quirks. Switching between them usually means reinstalling your entire operating system. But what if you never had to choose again? What if one system could run packages from multiple distributions simultaneously without virtualization or containers? This is exactly the radical idea behind Bedrock Linux, one of the most fascinating and unconventional projects in the entire Linux ecosystem. Bedrock Linux is not a traditional Linux distribution. Instead, it's more like a meta-distribution, a layer that allows multiple Linux distributions to coexist on the same system while sharing the same kernel and file system. The goal is surprisingly simple yet incredibly powerful. Allow users to combine the best parts of every Linux distribution into one unified environment. Instead of arguing about which distro is best, Bedrock Linux lets you use all of them at once. Imagine installing Arch Linux to access the Arch user repository, using Debian for rock-solid base libraries, running Void Linux for its lightweight tools, and pulling certain applications from Ubuntu repositories because they're easier to install there. In a Bedrock system, all of these can work together side by side. To understand why Bedrock Linux is so unique, it helps to look at how traditional Linux distributions work. A typical Linux distribution is essentially a curated collection of software packaged together with a package manager. Ubuntu uses apt, Arch uses Pacman, Fedora uses DNF, and so on. These package managers maintain databases of installed software and ensure dependencies are satisfied within their own ecosystem. Because of this design, mixing packages from different distributions is usually dangerous or outright impossible. Installing packages from Debian on Arch or vice versa can easily break the system because each distribution builds software with slightly different libraries, file structures, and assumptions. Bedrock Linux approaches the problem differently. Instead of trying to merge repositories or convert packages, Bedrock keeps each distribution isolated in its own environment while still allowing them to interact seamlessly. These environments are called strata. A stratum is essentially a minimal installation of a Linux distribution integrated into the Bedrock system. You might have an Arch stratum, a Debian stratum, and an Ubuntu stratum all running simultaneously. Each stratum maintains its own package manager and repositories exactly as if it were running on its own system. This means if you want to install software from Arch, you simply use Pacman inside the Arch stratum. If you want to install something from Debian, you use apt inside the Debian stratum. Bedrock doesn't try to unify the package managers. Instead, it allows them to coexist. The magic comes from how Bedrock makes programs from different strata appear as if they belong to one system. When you run a program installed from Arch, it can access files from Debian. When you launch a tool from Debian, it can interact with libraries or programs from other strata if necessary. Bedrock achieves this by carefully managing file system, paths, and environment variables so that everything feels integrated rather than isolated. Unlike containers or virtual machines, these strata are not separate systems. They share the same kernel, the same home directory, and the same hardware access. One of the most impressive aspects of Bedrock Linux is that you don't even have to install it as a standalone distribution. In most cases, you start with an existing Linux installation and then convert it into Bedrock. The process essentially transforms your current system into the first stratum. For example, if you start with Ubuntu, your Ubuntu installation becomes the Ubuntu stratum. After that, you can add additional distributions using Bedrock's management tools. Adding a new distribution is surprisingly simple. With a single command, Bedrock downloads and integrates a new stratum. Within minutes, you might have an Arch environment running alongside your original Ubuntu base. From that point forward, you can install packages from both ecosystems. You can use Pacman for Arch packages and apt for Ubuntu packages, all within the same operating system. This flexibility opens up possibilities that traditional Linux distributions simply cannot offer. For example, Developers often choose Arch Linux because of its bleeding-edge packages and massive R repository. However, Arch can sometimes be unstable for certain workloads. Debian, on the other hand, is incredibly stable but often ships older software versions. With Bedrock Linux, you could run a stable Debian-based system while pulling cutting-edge development tools from Arch. Another example involves proprietary software. Some commercial applications are only officially packaged for specific distributions like Ubuntu or Red Hat on a normal Linux system. This can create compatibility issues if your distro isn't supported. Bedrock Linux solves this problem by simply adding the supported distribution as a stratum. If a program requires Ubuntu packages, you install it within the Ubuntu stratum and run it normally. Gaming is another interesting use case. Certain gaming tools and drivers might be easier to install on one distribution compared to another. With Bedrock, you could keep your preferred desktop environment from one distro while installing gaming tools from another. Everything still works together as if it were a single coherent system. Despite sounding like a recent innovation, Bedrock Linux has actually been in development for many years. The project began as an experimental attempt to rethink how Linux distributions could interact with each other. Over time, it evolved into a mature system capable of integrating a wide variety of distributions. Today, Bedrock supports many popular Linux distros including Arch, Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, Void, Gentoo, Alpine, and several others. However, Bedrock Linux is not without its challenges. Combining multiple distributions into one environment introduces complexity that doesn't exist in traditional setups. Each distro has its own expectations about file system structure, libraries, and system configuration. Bedrock must carefully manage these differences to prevent conflicts. For instance, two distributions might provide different versions of the same library. If both versions exist on the system, applications must use the correct one. Bedrock handles this by controlling how programs locate libraries and dependencies. This ensures that software continues to work correctly even when different distributions provide different versions. Another challenge involves system services. Many distributions use different init systems or service management tools. Most modern distros rely on system, but some like Void Linux use runit instead. Bedrock typically relies on the init system from the base stratum while allowing software from other strata to function within that framework. Security and updates are also important considerations. Since each stratum maintains its own package manager, updates must be performed separately. You might run apt-update for Debian packages and pacman-su for Arch packages. While this requires slightly more maintenance, it also means each ecosystem remains intact and reliable. One of the most interesting philosophical aspects of Bedrock Linux is how it challenges the traditional idea of Linux distributions competing with each other. For decades, the Linux community has been divided into camps. Arch users argue with Ubuntu users, Fedora fans debate with Debian loyalists, and every distro claims its approach is the best. Bedrock Linux essentially sidesteps the entire argument by allowing users to combine whatever they like. Instead of choosing between stability and cutting-edge software, you can have both. Instead of switching distributions every time your needs change, you simply add another stratum. The result is a system tailored exactly to the user's preferences. However, Bedrock Linux is not aimed at beginners. While it's incredibly powerful, it requires a good understanding of how Linux systems work. Troubleshooting issues across multiple distributions can sometimes be complicated. If something breaks, you may need to understand which stratum is responsible and how its package manager works. Because of this complexity, Bedrock is often considered a tool for advanced users, developers, and Linux enthusiasts who enjoy experimenting with their systems. For these users, Bedrock represents something incredibly appealing: total control over the Linux environment. There's also an interesting cultural aspect to Bedrock: Linux. The Linux community has always been known for customization and experimentation. From tiling window managers to custom kernels, Linux users love pushing boundaries. Bedrock fits perfectly into this tradition by taking one of the most fundamental assumptions of Linux: the idea that you must choose a single distribution and completely overturning it. Some users even describe Bedrock as the ultimate Linux power user setup. Instead of constantly reinstalling distributions or maintaining multiple machines, everything can exist in one unified system. Want Arch's AUR, Debian's stability, Fedora's new technologies, and Alpine's lightweight utilities? Bedrock can combine them all. Of course, not every combination is practical. Some distributions integrate more smoothly than others, and certain software may still expect specific environments. But the fact that it works at all is a remarkable engineering achievement. Another fascinating detail is that Bedrock Linux doesn't replace the Linux kernel. It simply uses the kernel provided by the base distribution. This means hardware compatibility and drivers depend primarily on the base system. Additional strata mainly contribute userland software rather than core system components. Over the years, Bedrock developers have refined the system to improve compatibility and usability. Tools have been created to simplify managing strata, installing distributions, and controlling how programs interact with each other. The project documentation is extensive and helps users navigate the complexities of multi-distro environments. Despite its impressive capabilities, Bedrock Linux remains relatively niche compared to mainstream distributions like Ubuntu or Fedora. This is partly because most users simply don't need such extreme flexibility. For everyday tasks like browsing, office work, and gaming, a single well-maintained distribution is usually more than enough. But for certain users, Bedrock represents a completely different way of thinking about operating systems. Instead of treating distributions as mutually exclusive choices, Bedrock treats them as modular components that can be mixed and matched. In a way, Bedrock Linux reflects the deeper philosophy of open-source software. The Linux ecosystem thrives because thousands of projects contribute ideas and innovations. Different distributions experiment with different approaches, and the best ideas spread across the community. Bedrock takes this diversity and turns it into a feature rather than a limitation. Looking toward the future, projects like Bedrock Linux raise interesting questions about how operating systems might evolve. As containerization, modular systems, and cross-platform tools become more common, the boundaries between different software ecosystems may continue to blur. Bedrock already demonstrates that these boundaries are more flexible than many people assumed. For Linux enthusiasts who enjoy exploring the limits of what the platform can do, Bedrock Linux offers something truly unique. It's not just another distribution with a different desktop theme or package manager. It's a radical rethinking of what a Linux system can be. Instead of forcing users to choose sides in the endless distro debates, Bedrock simply says you can have everything. Arch, Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, Void, and more can all coexist in one powerful system. The result is a Linux environment that adapts to the user rather than forcing the user to adapt to the distribution. In the end, Bedrock Linux isn't about replacing traditional distributions. Those distros still serve millions of users perfectly well. Instead, Bedrock exists for people who want to push Linux further, experiment with its flexibility, and build something entirely their own. And that's what makes Bedrock Linux so fascinating. It turns the entire Linux ecosystem into a toolbox rather than a set of competing choices. Every distribution becomes a resource you can draw from. Every package manager becomes another option. Every repository becomes part of your system. For many users, that idea alone is enough to spark curiosity. Because once you realize that your computer could run the best parts of multiple Linux distributions at the same time, it's hard not to wonder why operating systems were ever limited to just one in the first place.